thank you so much, Mohan and the CARE team for inviting me to talk about subalternity and participate in your exciting conference. And I have been a visiting faculty here for the last term, so I've been a little exposed to the really important political work that CARE is doing. So it really is an honor to have an opportunity to dialogue with you all and perhaps find ways to contribute to how you can extend your conversations about the work that you do forward. So because this is a health communication conference, I should say at the outset that I am not a health communication scholar in any way. So to that extent, perhaps I am an odd person here. But with the recognition that health, understood broadly, informs every aspect of our lives. So I want to therefore, for those of you who may not be very familiar with my work, even though Mohan contextualized a little bit, want to say a few things about my own background and political and intellectual investments, primarily because that informs how I perceive and relate to the work and the kind of issues being posed in this forum, although I have to admit that because I start teaching on Monday, I could not be here the whole time yesterday. I had to go back for work to the department, but still I got a sense of the issues being raised yesterday. So I am by training, the word I hate, but I will use it. I am by training a post-colonial transnational feminist and cultural studies scholar in the field of communication, but I work at a very interdisciplinary nexus. So I kind of these days see myself more as a sociologist of communication, media, and everyday culture. And how to theorize inequality and power in the context of colonialism, nationalism, globalization suffuses all my work. These are the issues that are politically very dear to me. Now, in contrast to a reductive empiricism, where the empirical seemingly is transparent and can explain the event or phenomena that is being studied by a scholar, towards which so much of social science and applied communication scholarship seems to be oriented today, my work is deeply theoretically oriented, although always situated in particular contexts that require theoretical explanations. Theorizing is something that I deeply value as an intellectual. And I say this especially because in today's neoliberal academic world, the drive towards crass empiricism and applied work that can seemingly draw funders at the cost of this theory is increasingly being devalued. And yet, without sound theorization, without asking high and complex theoretical questions, without engaging in sophisticated theoretical debates, I have learned from the works of scholars who have shaped me that we cannot provide explanations for the complexities of power in our world. This is our obligation as intellectuals. I also say this because I felt yesterday for the short time that I was here, and if I understood correctly, and I say this of course in a very friendly way, hopefully in a generative and productive way, that high theory was perhaps being pushed aside and minimized. But perhaps maybe not, it could be my misunderstanding. So I also wanted to emphasize this. So as I have argued in a recent forum on theorizing that was held a couple of years back in the Western Journal of Communication, about the importance of theory and why we have less strong theory today than we used to have earlier. As I have argued in that issue, theory is about the imagination of better worlds, unthought worlds, worlds of possibilities and impossibilities. But of course, I reject theory for theory's sake. I reject theory as a fetish. With Stuart Hall, some of you would know Stuart Hall's work, British cultural studies scholar. I have, with him and inspired by him, I have always believed that theory, solid sophisticated theorizing, is a detour and should be a detour towards something more important. and that something more important to me is always a political project. One of the reasons I kind of wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the importance of theory, including high theory, is that, as I will talk shortly, is that the Subaltern Studies project generated some extremely important theoretical questions whose answers that they might have attempted may not have been perfect. There are no perfect answers in social sciences, but the questions that they generated still resonate with us and I think challenge us as intellectuals. So my charge here is to speak about subaltern studies, and I'm going to talk more about the South Asian subaltern studies, even though there is Latin American subaltern studies, which was formalized in 1993 roughly and was influenced by the South Asian project. And I'm talking more of the South Asian Subaltern Studies project because my sense is that this context in this forum probably lends itself more to that, the musings of that group. Now the Subaltern Studies group has provided, as I said, some of the most sophisticated theoretical questions related to issues of power, oppression, how to speak for the other, etc., over the last 35 years. And more important for me, the theoretical contribution that the Subaltern Studies group made to me is one issue, that is, how do we know what we know? How do we know what we know? And the problem of historiography, not history in with a capital H, but the problem of recording or writing the history of what Deleuze might call minor lives, broadly the politics of knowledge production itself. Now, I am not an expert on subaltern studies. In fact, even to sit at this table and talk about subaltern studies is a little overwhelming for me, just because it's such a complex and sophisticated project. But I am quite familiar with the imperatives and the impulses of the project. So I do not speak from a position of expertise, but I speak from a position of familiarity. Please keep that in mind. So I'm going to provide, I thought, a brief overview of the South Asian Subaltern Studies group, because I'm not sure how many of us here know about the main developments and what they were trying to do. But if you do know about it, please, I beg your indulgence, and I hope you will be patient and allow me to touch upon a few points. Now, the Subaltern Studies, the South Asian Subaltern Studies group, as we loosely talk about, use this phrase, really comprised of a group of Indian historians led by the eminent and one of the most brilliant scholars of our times, Ranojit Guha. And there were others like Gautam Bhadro, Said Amin, Dipesh Chakraborty, Gyan Pandey, and so many others. I don't want to do a laundry list here, who were Marxist, of course, in their leanings and in their engagement with history. Now, they were post-independence. They were very disappointed with what they were seeing after India's independence, the elitist and the official history of Indian nationalism that was being written by elite historians, okay, and by national leaders. The same betrayal that they found in colonialism, okay, of the masses in India, they found that same betrayal now post-independence, right up to the 1970s, which was a very important moment in India with the Naxalite movement and various Maoist uprisings. The same betrayal they found in nationalism, okay, in the national elite, where the elite histories of the nation did not make room for the peasants. Ranojit Guha was very concerned with the peasants, the undocumented peasants. There were no formal archives of peasant activities. So this led them to ask the larger question of how to write the history of the peasant in India, or peasants, peasant uprisings, when the principles of writing history thus far had been reliant on classical European historiography and had shored up monumental notions of national struggles. Okay. So they were very, I don't want to say against, but they were very critical of the kind of official versions of Indian national struggle that were coming out from, people from versions of someone like Nehru or Gandhi, or the historians who were very influenced by the Cambridge School and the Oxford School. Remember that Indian historiography, official Indian historiography after independence, when it was written, was very influenced by the European classical principles of writing history, because there had been no other ways of thinking about history till this group made its intervention. So the South Asian Subaltern Studies group, one can say, emerged out of a critique of and a disappointment with the post-colonial state, the Indian post-colonial state, and the nationalist independence, or the failure of nationalist independence to deliver to the masses the promise upon which national struggles had been waged. And for those of us who might be a little familiar with India's post-independence history, it is important to situate the emergence, or at least the thinkings, of the Subaltern Studies project in the same despair that led to the Naxalite movement in India. And the other Maoist uprisings, the absolute disappointment with post-independence India and the kind of oppression of the lower class masses and the peasants, which this group was concerned with. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is that today, while the South Asian Subaltern Studies group has acquired international recognition, and we even romanticize their work, it's initially, as Deepesh Chakraborty has talked about somewhere, I cannot remember where because I read his work so much I often forget the source, but initially the work that they were doing, the thinking that they were producing, occurred in like these small informal rooms. It was not official. They took a great risk in their career. They were often, Chakraborty talks about how they were often laughed at. So as I remember this, I also remember in a very different way how the British Culture Studies project emerged. So it was very unofficial. They were like, as they said, they were making it along, as they were moving, because there were no official archives. There were no official documents about the peasants. So how do you put together, quote unquote, the historical evidence, right? So that got into larger issues of what counts as evidence, etc., etc. Now, formally, at least, in terms of when the written word began to emerge, it emerged in the early 1980s. And there were about, if I'm remembering correctly, 13 volumes of the Subaltern Studies, volume 1 to 13. Then the group disbanded in 1998. Now, in the Subaltern Studies work, you had some influences of British historians doing the works of scholars like E.P. Thompson, writing history from below. However, and I want to say this, they reworked the notion of writing history from below. And I say this because often, like when I get manuscripts to review, the Subaltern Studies, the South Asian Subaltern Studies group is simply seen as imitating the history from below project of British Marxism. They were influenced by that, but the logic of capital in the UK and in Europe was very different, as Deepesh Chakraborty's work has pointed out, than the logic of capital in colonial modernity in India. So to say that they were merely replicating the history from below project of British Marxism is, I think, doing disservice to what they were trying to do. The term subaltern, as I think all of us perhaps know here, originally came from Gramsci, and Gramsci used the term to refer to someone in a junior rank, typically in the army, given the context he was writing in. But it was expanded when the group used the term subaltern, and then with Spivak, who I will talk about later, it kind of got another electrification, got charged up again. Now, there is no, in the time that I have, there is no easy way to give a strong synopsis of the Subaltern Studies project. And so what I have done is really kind of like, the Subaltern Studies 101 that I going to with introductory undergrads, but perhaps not even that. Now, I think different people would talk about the Subaltern Study, the development of the South Asian Subaltern Studies project in different ways. But I tend to see the work in terms of two phases, and I will tell you why. The first phase is like from 1983 when they started publishing their volumes till about 1988. In 1988, where I see the second phase, and again I will explain why, 1988 published Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, which not only through some very important theoretical challenges, not in a disrespectful way, but in a very generative way, but also this was the time when Spivak's Subaltern Studies Deconstructing Historiography came out. Around the same time, another very important work came out that also problematized in a very productive way the Subaltern Studies project, and that was Rosalind O'Hanlon's very important essay, Recovering the Subject, that somehow I don't see as being cited as much these days. So let me kind of elaborate this a little bit. Now, when Ranojit Guha and others formulated the project in late 1970s and started publishing their writings in the early 80s, as we know, they were concerned with their main charge, their main interest was how do we recover the consciousness of the peasants? Okay. What's the evidence? What's the documentation? Where are the records? But how do we recover the consciousness of the peasants that they would call subaltern? Guha's quest was for a history in which the subaltern was going to be the maker of his or her own destiny. At that time it was more his, because they were rarely engaging the issue of gender till Spivak came and gave them a jolt. So Guha's quest for history in which the subaltern was the maker of his own destiny, as Chakraborty interpreting Guha says, brought our attention very significantly in the field of history certainly, but also more broadly in terms of how do we produce knowledge about the oppressed, brought our attention to the relation between text and power, or I want to say text, power, and the intellectual. And yet this issue, that how do we recover the consciousness of the peasants, yet this issue that Deepesh Chakraborty once termed in a very witty way, remained one of the most problematic and yet generative in terms of the theoretical questions it further produced of the project, or what Chakraborty called the thorny question of the consciousness, the thorny question of recovering the consciousness. That resulted in a lot of internal debates within the group, and then Gayatri Spivak, who was never, it's important to remember that, was never a formal part of the group. She was invited to contribute, but she's never formally seen herself as a subalternist, even though her much later work talks about subalternity much more than her earlier work. So this thorny question of consciousness, or recovering the voice of the subaltern, I think is very central for communication studies, thinking about these issues. So I said just a minute back, is that 1988, as I see it, was a very important moment, which for me marks, another phase of the beginning of the Subaltern Studies project, because that's when Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak was published. Now, I am assuming that most of us know Spivak's work, but at the same time, perhaps some of us might not. So again, if you will indulge me, let me just make a few points about her. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak is a university professor at Columbia University. She is a post-colonial feminist, Marxist, social and cultural theorist. And in my view, she is one of the most notable intellectuals of the 20th and 21st century. And I know of very few scholars whose work can simultaneously hold together so many scales of analysis, the global, the national, the local, the gendered subject. So many things together come into her work, geopolitics. Now, Spivak's accolades and awards are limitless, and most recently she was awarded the Kyoto Prize in Japan, which is kind of said to be the Nobel Prize in the humanities, because there is no Nobel Prize in the humanities. And most recently, a couple of years back, she was awarded the Padma Bhushan, which is the third civilian award in India. So one can say so much about Spivak, again, for which one might need more than a seminar. So I'm going to talk about, very briefly again, what Spivak brought to the Subaltern Studies project and the kind of theoretical questions, as I keep saying, that her interventions generated. Spivak introduced the issue of representation and ideology into the Subaltern Studies project, thus interrupting it in very important ways. That is, she challenged the notion of the transparency of the peasant and the peasant consciousness, as though I can access the peasant, this was a critique of Guha, and I can recover the peasant consciousness, and as though the line between me and the intellectual is free of ideology, and that there is a transparent relationship. So the problem of representation and the problem of ideology is what Spivak, the challenge that Spivak threw at the Subaltern Studies project, in the very same essay that she simultaneously brilliantly was also critiquing Michel Foucault and Deleuze for their transparent desire to seemingly be able to speak with or for the oppressed. The other issue of the many other issues that Spivak also brought to the table where this project, where the Subaltern Studies project was concerned, is that she argued that somehow there is in their project a very romantic notion that if the oppressed fully know of their oppression, that is, the oppressed can fully know of their oppression, they can always make arguments, I'm saying it very simply, they can always make arguments about their own self-interest, i.e. the oppressed can fully know about the conditions of their oppression, which again erases the question of ideology. I mean, history oftentimes shows, and we know that, the oppressed often may not work in their own self-interest. So that very romantic notion, or one of the romantic threads of the project, is something that Spivak also kind of challenged but nuanced the project. So at one level, some of the contributions that Spivak, or expansions, might be a better word, that Spivak made to the Subaltern Studies project relates to larger questions, which I think might also be relevant for the care work, the care research team, related to subalternity or broadly oppression, representation, knowledge production, and the positionality of the intellectual. And that if I can seemingly, and I put the word seemingly within quotes, give quote unquote power to the oppressed, are the oppressed always able to know the full extent of their oppression? Because the issue of ideology is very much there. So what are some of the theoretical implications, if you will, that emerge from this? One is to recognize that the intellectual is not transparent. The intellectual is not outside of ideology, as though the subaltern can be directly accessed in purest ways. And as though if we could make the subaltern speak, the subaltern would be able to be cognizant of the full extent of her or his oppression. And the intellectual's own position remains veiled then. Second, and this second point has been brilliantly and beautifully elaborated in Rosalind O'Hanlon's 1988 or 89 essay, Recovering the Subject, is the danger of essentializing and romanticizing the consciousness of the oppressed. And the third issue is the issue of representation. That as scholars, as intellectuals, trying to engage in issues of oppression, we are ultimately always caught by the limits of representation, the limits of language itself. Now, to say that, Spivak would say, is not to throw up our hands in despair, but to recognize the limits of representation. No scholarship, in my view, no scholarship can ever escape the limits of representation, and hence the paradox of knowledge production itself. We work with that, we work through that, but without falling into some kind of a romanticized trap that seemingly tells us that the lines between us and the oppressed are free of any ideology. Now, Deepesh Chakraborty, whose work, along with Spivak's work, I am greatly influenced by and I admire, also made a similar point once, where he too was talking about the theoretical problem of trying to recover the consciousness of the peasant or the subaltern or the oppressed, whatever term you want to use. And that is, Chakraborty says that there is no guarantee that the same behavior of the oppressed or the same desire. So let's say a group of oppressed people say, we want this, whatever this is. He says that there is no guarantee, though, that the same behavior or desire is produced by only one state of consciousness. There can be various states of consciousness producing one desire. So the correlation between, the oppressed think this way and therefore they want that, is kind of like a politics without guarantees, as Stuart Hall would say. And again, that gets at the very important issue of not falling into a very reductive empiricism when engaging with issues of subalternity. The other issue that Spivak brought into the Subaltern Studies project, which I will not dwell here upon, is the issue of gender, the gendered subaltern studies. What is the condition of the gendered subaltern? Because at one level, the Subaltern Studies project, at least to me, helps me nuance my thinking about questions of power and inequality. One of the things that I think is problematic in Ranajit Guha's initial formulation of the subaltern or the peasant is that he talked about the peasant as a space of difference from the elite. Right, the peasant as the subaltern as a space of difference from the elite or the middle class. But people like about Spivak and Chakraborty very rightly have critiqued that, saying that these are like these two silos. It's like the subaltern class and then the peasant class and then the elite class, a very binaristic relationship, when the relationship of power may not be that binaristic. Now, I have often seen in works that, in my view, very superficially engage the term subalternity, often actually talking about marginality, but using the term subalternity, and subalternity and marginality are absolutely not the same. Subalternity for Spivak is a position without identity. The moment you have identity, the moment you are able to say I, you're already engaging in a relationship between the self and yourself and the world. There is then recognition already. So you cannot say I. So subalternity is a position without identity. The goal, of course, is to move the position into identity and therefore into hegemony. As Spivak says, no one can say I am a subaltern because you're cut off from lines of access to power. Now, Rosalind Morris, a brilliant cultural anthropologist, in a discussion of Spivak's notion of subalternity, and sometimes Spivak uses the word radical alterity, reminds us that to engage radical alterity and to remember that we cannot always access subalternity, is to be reminded of, and I quote, the ungraspable, very important, the ungraspable otherness that remains beyond our reach and that also constitutes who we are. The otherness in relation to which we are both indebted and unable to know the full extent of our accountability. Extreme marginality is not subalternity. I get papers passing my desk where people will use the word marginality, subalternity when they're talking about marginality. If you're talking about a space where, however marginal that might be, where there is some access to representation, some access to power, then that cannot be subalternity. Important to keep in mind, because it is, in my view, and in the views of many others whose work influences me, it is important to keep alive the possibility that there are spaces and positionalities that escape our recognition. That is the radical alterity. Yeah. Now, another issue, very familiar one for many of us perhaps, that gets raised when we talk about the Subaltern Studies project, especially Spivak's intervention, is, can the subaltern speak? Literally, can the subaltern speak? And I think this question gets bandied around oftentimes in places by people who have rarely read Spivak or have any significant familiarity with the project. But this question, can the subaltern speak, seemingly has transcended the essay itself and makes its own circuits in intellectual circles. Now, Megan Morris once said, and I love this, that Gayatri Spivak never said that the subaltern cannot talk, but the subaltern cannot speak, because speech immediately brings us into structures of recognition, but talking is a different matter, right? And many of us who are communication scholars, we know that, in graduate school, we all have to do introduction to speech communication, so we had to understand what speech was, what rhetoric was. So Spivak is not saying the subaltern cannot talk, but the subaltern cannot speak. Okay? Very important distinction that I wish more people like Megan Morris showed up. Another thing to remember about the Subaltern Studies project is that when it initially started, it was not, nor did it ever position itself as a post-colonial studies project. I mean, the word post-colonial was barely used in the early 1980s. But after Spivak and in the 1990s, now it gets recuperated under the umbrella of post-colonial studies, but many Subaltern Studies project scholars may not even want to use the term post-colonial studies. But of course, now it's influenced on post-colonial studies and the kind of questions that it has raised about the betrayal of nationalism, the betrayal of colonialism of the masses, representation, knowledge production, so on and so forth, have been central now to even how we can conceive of the project of post-colonial studies. So what are some other theoretical issues that we might say the Subaltern Studies project brings about or throws up? And I know I've said this, but I do want to say this again: the limits of language and representation. No intellectual project can escape representation. Second, the always already, and I'm using the word always already drawing from Derrida, always already betrayal of our frameworks. Our frameworks will betray at one point the oppressed. But there is no need to throw our hands and stop doing what we do, but trying to finesse it more, trying to refine our frameworks. Chakraborty, Dipesh Chakraborty once made a very interesting point, and if you have heard him, he's a very witty speaker. He said that in the kind of work that many of us do, there is no right answer. There is no right answer for various reasons, because our context keeps changing, power relations keep changing, but there is no right answer. So the best that you can do is to produce a very important, and I'm using his phrase, a very important generative mistake that generates important questions. Okay? So Chakraborty says that because of the always already betrayal of our framework, this is my language, Chakraborty says, the more important task might be to generate important mistakes whose questions, the underlying questions, remain with us and move debates along. Because really there is no perfect framework. Now, I'm going to get ready to wrap up, but there are a couple of points that I wanted to, in a very friendly and generative way, respond to, or at least address, that I kind of thought I heard yesterday. And one was, as I said earlier in my talk, the devaluing of high theory. Now, there is undoubtedly a lot of very shoddy, shallow, banal cultural theory, critical theory, and culture studies work being produced, just because now it's become a fad. Just as there's a lot of shoddy, banal, insignificant, irrelevant, applied, crass empirical work also being produced, in a neoliberal academy. But our models are always the best that an area offers. So theorizing, as I said earlier, especially high theory, needs to be valued for the complexities of thinking that it can open up, that mere empirical work cannot. Now, having said this, I want to qualify this, knowing the kind of audience I'm speaking to, that I'm not arguing against empiricism. Okay? Empirical material is important, but how we define the empirical, of course, is a matter of debate. I am arguing against reductive empiricism, where seemingly the empirical becomes transparent symptom of the phenomenon. So high cultural theory is very important, but not theory as a fetish. Someone like Stuart Hall, and I'm referring to Stuart Hall because I think this audience is familiar with his work, is in my view a very high, sophisticated cultural theorist whose work is always grounded in context. Theory as a detour towards something more important. So let us not devalue in a superficial way the importance of high theory. The other kind of thread that I felt I picked up yesterday, and again I say this in a very friendly way, just to kind of have more conversations around these things, is that deconstruction, I think someone said that was shooting down deconstruction. While I can't remember the whole thing, it's important to remember that oftentimes people use the term deconstruction, and I'm not saying this particular person was, but generally I've seen this, without necessarily having a strong base in scholars like Derrida or Diman or even Spivak. Deconstruction simply gets seen as breaking something down as opposed to constructing something. That is not what deconstruction is about. That's the everyday notion of deconstruction. I'm deconstructing whatever, the food that I'm cooking. That's not what we're talking about. Deconstruction as a movement, as an intellectual movement, as an offshoot of post-structuralism, does not say, and has never said in that categorical way, there is no truth. That's not what they're interested in. Deconstruction is interested in the production of truth, the relations through which what something gets categorized as truth is produced, which is very different from saying there is no truth. Okay? Of course, there is no truth in that capital T ways, but there are small truths without which we cannot function in life. And deconstruction looks at the logics through which truth, quote unquote, gets produced, how that moves. So to be a really strong deconstructionist, I think it's very important to really read some of these scholars well. Yeah, the other point that I want to make, and this is more, and Mohan is my dear friend, so I feel free to, and we've had discussions, so I feel free to bring this up, although I'm not sure Mohan was necessarily saying this. But the issue of affect, like you were saying that theories of affect are kind of free-floating, they don't go anywhere. Yes, there's a lot of shoddy work being done on affect. Everybody wants to talk about affect, where oftentimes it is not grounded at all. But to me, the work being done, the best work being done under the rubric of affect is very important to me for the kinds of work and the questions we are interested in, because often the affective states of the oppressed are mobilized by the state, okay, or by dominant powers, again in their self-interest. Okay, or the kinds of affects that get generated in them might produce particular actions, okay, which may or may not be desirable. So to understand the affective states of the oppressed, I think is very important as a way to understand, quote unquote, their conditions of oppression. So I just want to end on this, knowing that there is so much more that can be said, and I'm afraid that I might have taken far too much time than I had anticipated, perhaps leaving Amber with very little time, for which I apologize.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much.
But I'm always happy to hear what you have to say.
I was thinking about looking at how we could map the Culture Center project and care as a center, this conference in its
So I was hoping that we could map the ideals of this project, of this seminar, which is we're talking about communication for social change, intersections of theory and praxis, into what Dr. Shom talked about in terms of subaltern studies, the project of the subaltern studies. And as she spoke, I sort of jotted down points that I think we could pick up to see linkages between subaltern studies and the Culture Center project, as it is evolving. And I have 20 points to talk about. So I don't think that's the right way to go about doing it right now. I think we have 14 minutes left for the panel to end. So I think it would be good to sort of open up and go around with questions and see if we can go back and forth with certain with discussions on what has been spoken now and throughout the conference. Okay, fine, I'll do that. I'll do that very, very quickly then. These are the important points that I think that we can pick up from the Subaltern Studies project and map onto or help in the evolution of the CARE project. Number one is, how do we know what we know? Okay, when we are looking at the writing of history or historiography, the graphing of history as it is happening now, who are the people who are erased? Like what is erased? What are the discourses that are erased? How do we work towards retrieving these erasures? Okay, what really struck me is when Dr. Shom was talking about how the Subaltern Studies project came about, and how I think that the theorizing the CCA was coming through in around 2005, 2008, is the idea of despair, disappointment. Talking about what exists. Yes. It started off as a project in health communication, looking at how large parts of the globe and how stories are made around health in large parts of the globe are left out of what we know as the European discourse of health communication. That was the impetus. That was so that struck a sort of a similar. It struck a chord with me. The other point that I think is also very important and connects very well to the CCA is the idea of risk. In the projects that we have done and the projects that are being done through CARE now, where you are basically going in and starting this whole program of seeing through the change, of also evaluating the change, there is this import of putting one's self at stake. Now, by self, I'm talking about not only your intellectual self, but also the body as a performative body at stake onto the field in front, together with the idea that you are always talking about reflexivity, the idea of positionality, questioning yourself, being vulnerable, opening yourself up to be disputed. And that also links ourselves a lot to the Subaltern Studies project as I think about it. Representation, ideology, and something that I think the CCA has always been concerned about. When you're talking about culture, structure, and agency, you're looking at how life comes into being. And when you're talking about how these inform each other to influence how subjects at the margins are able to speak, not talk, right? Are able to speak or speak in a way that matters. You are basically looking at retrieval of those voices and the interlocutor in between. So ideas of representation, ideas of ideology cannot be taken away. So the next move then, and I think this is important for the culture-centered approach, is what is the move that can happen here for us to take this to the level where we are able to evaluate our work, okay, without falling into what Dr. Shom talked about, the potholes of reductive empiricism. How do we do that? And that has to be done at some point. It is very, very important for us to theorize. It is also very important for us to see that this theorization translates to changes on the ground, or at least that is the way I look at the work that I want to do. So that becomes very important for me. So my question there was then, what then is the method of working with the subaltern? Okay. I come from a social scientific paradigm in communication, and I have imbibed cultural studies, different aspects of critical studies into my work, but my schooling still remains there. So that is a very important impetus for me. How do I work with? Okay. In spite of who I am, because of who I am. So all of that comes together. And this is probably my last point before we have questions around is, when we talk about the arrival of the subaltern, right, what happens then? Does the project of subalternity end there with the arrival of the subaltern, or does that, if the project ends there, are we leaving the non-subaltern community as a, well, if I can say it that way, as a homogeneous space, which is not, right? My arrival to, or if I were in that state, my arrival into hegemony would probably be different from a Dalit's arrival into hegemony. Okay, and then what are the spaces that are being provided in this quote-unquote post-subaltern milieu? Are they uniform? Are they homogeneous? Or should we stop there? So this, I think, is something where where CARE and CCA can sort of, when you're looking at the continuous interplay and the continuous change of culture, structure, and agency, this is something that we can probably theorize and think about engaging with as we step out into programs that focus towards implementation, towards creating implementation as well as evaluation. So I'll leave us with these thoughts and see what questions we can have in.